The ink was barely dry on the closing papers when I stepped out onto the deck of my new house in Nag's Head. The wind carried the sharp tang of the Atlantic, the kind of salt air that clung to your skin and whispered of freedom. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe as though the air belonged to me. The house wasn't extravagant, just weathered shingles, wide windows, and a view of the dunes that bent gracefully toward the water. But it was mine, a space I had carved from years of quiet labor, a declaration that I no longer lived under anyone's shadow. The phone rang before I'd even set down the folder with my deed. Marcella's name lit up the screen. My sister's voice came through sharp, practiced in command, leaving no space for me to speak. "We'll arrive in 3 hours with 22 of my in-laws. Clear the rooms. Fix meals for everyone. We're staying 2 weeks." Her words landed not as a request, but as a decree, as though the house had always been hers. I stood in the empty living room, the ocean spilling light across the bare floorboards, and felt a familiar sting tighten in my chest. I knew this tone. I had grown up with it, bent beneath it, learned to quiet myself while she barked orders that our parents always rushed to fulfill. Still, I didn't answer right away. I let her words echo against the walls that had never known her, never sheltered her. The house was mine, bought with my savings, my effort, my name etched cleanly on the deed. On the outside, I stayed steady, my voice, even when I finally said, "I hear you, Marcella." Inside, something else stirred, an old ache mixing with a steel I hadn't felt in years. I ended the call and stared at the horizon, the water restless but constant. 3 hours. That was the time she had given me, and I already knew it would be enough. As I stood in the quiet of my beach house, the past rose up like the tide, dragging me back to Raleigh, where Marcella and I first learned our roles. She was the fire, always demanding, always certain the world owed her a place at the head of the table. I was the patient one, smoothing sharp edges, holding silence when silence seemed the only way to keep peace. Our parents encouraged it without realizing, praising her boldness, excusing her tantrums, and leaning on me to be the steady one who didn't make trouble. I remember birthday dinners where Marcella insisted on the biggest slice of cake, and my parents would laugh, handing it over. I remember school projects where she bragged loudly about what she hadn't done, and I was the one up late finishing it, too tired to protest. By the time we reached high school, the pattern was fixed. Marcella pushed, I yielded. She demanded, I delivered. And when our parents died years later, nothing changed, it only hardened. Marcella seized control of the estate, speaking as though she alone carried the family name. Relatives deferred to her. I became the background figure, the sibling who never fought, the one assumed to agree. My words rarely landed. If I questioned her, she twisted it into selfishness or weakness, and everyone nodded along. I slipped into the role so deeply that I hardly recognized the quiet bitterness building inside me. That phone call in my beach house was not new. It was the same voice that had dictated my life since childhood, expecting compliance. But as the waves crashed outside my window, I realized the ground beneath me had shifted. The deed in my folder wasn't just paper. It was proof that I had finally stepped out from the long shadow of her control. I could almost see us as children again, Marcella stamping her foot, me folding my hands to keep from trembling. Yet here, in Nag's Head, it wasn't fear that filled me. It was a kind of calm resolve I had never known, the sense that I could finally decide what role I would play. And with 3 hours ahead of me, I was already choosing. When our parents passed, I believed grief might soften Marcella's grip. That loss might teach her to share. Instead, it gave her more room to tighten her hold. The estate was divided on paper, but in practice, Marcella spoke as if everything bore her name alone. She carried herself like the heir apparent, a queen without crown or consent. Relatives nodded, neighbors deferred, and I, tired from years of smoothing arguments, kept quiet longer than I should have. The family farm in Johnston County went first. It had been my father's pride, rows of soybeans and corn stretching past the horizon. I wanted to keep it, or at least lease the land so it stayed in production. Marcella insisted on selling. Too much work, she said, though she'd never lifted a hand in the fields. Within months, it was gone, parceled to developers, flattened for tract housing. Then the house in Raleigh. Our childhood rooms still smelled faintly of cedar from the old closets. I suggested restoring it, even living there while we figured out what came next. Marcella brought in contractors within weeks, tearing down walls, gutting the rooms. By the time she was finished, the place was unrecognizable, our memories scrubbed as though they were stains. I stood by through each decision, my protests brushed aside with a laugh or a sharp word. She called it practical. I knew it for what it was, control. The same pattern that had shaped us since we were children, piece by piece. What could have been shared was swallowed by her certainty. The beach house was supposed to be different. It wasn't inherited, wasn't tied to our past. It was bought with my money. The result of years of shifts at Duke Regional, of living frugally while others assumed I had nothing of my own. I imagined it as a clean slate, a place free of Marcella's reach. But her call reminded me she didn't need to own the deed to lay claim. Entitlement had always been her currency. And now, with the Atlantic outside my window and 3 hours ticking down, I understood that I couldn't let history repeat itself again. I knew the trap the moment I hung up. If I told Marcella no directly, it would spiral the way it always had. She would raise her voice, twist my refusal into cruelty, and by the time the shouting settled, I would be the one branded ungrateful or selfish. That had been the rhythm of our lives, her demanding, me defending, and everyone else nodding along as if her version of events was the only truth. But this house was not a shared inheritance. It was mine, a line drawn in ink and witnessed by law. I could not let her turn it into another battlefield where I came away the loser. For once, I would not fight on her terms. I pulled out the folder I'd carried since closing and flipped through the notes I had scribbled in the margins. During the process of buying, I'd gathered names, local services, management companies, contacts in case I ever wanted to rent the house seasonally. I had thought of them as possibilities for the future. Now they became tools for survival. I called a property manager in Nag's Head, explained I needed the house booked immediately, and asked if he had tenants ready. He did tourists waiting for an opening, willing to pay above market for a last-minute stay. We set the contract in motion. Then I called a catering company in Kill Devil Hills, arranging food delivery that very evening. Last, I placed a call to a moving crew, requesting they be on standby in case I needed help with linens and furniture. With each call, a strange calm settled in me. I wasn't panicked, wasn't racing. I was deliberate, precise, as though every year of silence had been preparing me for this moment. Marcella had given me 3 hours. That was enough. When I set the phone down, the house seemed to steady around me. The ocean beyond the glass sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for her storm to pass. I was preparing for it. I moved through the house slowly, room by room, letting my hand graze the bare walls as if to anchor myself. Each space was still unmarked by furniture or family photographs, a blank canvas waiting for me to decide what it would hold. I paused in the largest bedroom, picturing the view Marcella would have claimed for herself, barking orders while everyone else fell in line. The thought no longer filled me with dread, it only sharpened my resolve. The property manager called back within the hour. A family from Virginia Beach had been desperate for a 2-week rental and would arrive that evening. They had already wired the deposit higher than market rate for the last-minute booking. His tone carried both surprise and respect when I agreed without hesitation. I could hear the clicking of his keyboard as he confirmed the paperwork. The house would be ready, he promised, and he would arrive personally to oversee the handoff. I hung up and walked into the kitchen. The counters gleamed, empty except for my folder and the stack of papers I had carried from Raleigh. I opened the envelope I had kept hidden for years, photocopies of withdrawals Marcella had made from the family trust, transactions written under my name when I was too weary to fight. I remembered the nights I'd come home from Duke Regional after double shifts, smelling of disinfectant and exhaustion, while she drained accounts I had helped build. I slid the documents into the fireproof safe I had tucked into a closet. They weren't just records, they were proof that I hadn't imagined the theft, that my silence had a cost. I wasn't ready to use them, not yet, but knowing they were close by steadied me more than the locked door or deed. When I closed the safe and turned the key, I felt the house shift from fragile to fortified. The rooms no longer seemed vulnerable. They felt prepared, and so was I, as the sound of distant tires on the highway reminded me the hours were slipping away. The first car rolled into the driveway just as the sun began its slow dip toward the water. Within minutes, more followed, a caravan of minivans and SUVs spilling onto the street until the curb was jammed with unfamiliar license plates. Doors slammed, voices rose, and children bolted across the sand path toward the porch as if it already belonged to them. Laughter carried on the wind, too loud for walls that had never held them. Marcella stepped out of the lead car like a commander surveying her conquest. She didn't knock, didn't pause. Instead, she began directing bodies, pointing to the second floor for luggage, waving toward the kitchen for the boxes of groceries they had brought. Her in-laws moved as though rehearsed, hauling coolers and suitcases without so much as a glance in my direction. To them, this house was already theirs for 2 weeks, and I was nothing more than the doorman holding the key. I stood in the entryway, calm, my hands steady at my sides. Years ago, I would have rushed forward to help, to ease the transition, to make myself useful so as not to cause waves. But now I waited, watching as Marcella barked. Get the children settled upstairs, leave the wine on the counter. Celeste, where are the spare linens? Her eyes flicked past me, already calculating which room she would claim for herself. The largest bedroom, of course the one with the ocean view. It was the same look I had seen on her face as a girl, when she would stamp her foot until our parents gave her the biggest slice, the better toy, the louder praise. Don't unload, I said finally, my voice even but clear. The words landed like a stone in water. For the first time since they'd arrived, the noise paused, suitcases hung midair. A cooler shifted awkwardly in someone's arms. Marcella turned, disbelief flashing into irritation. What do you mean? Don't unload. This is the house. We're here. I met her stare without flinching. Not tonight. Marcella. The silence stretched, taut as a rope pulled to breaking, and in that stillness, I felt the tide of the evening begin to turn. Marcella's eyes narrowed, her voice slicing through the heavy pause. What are you talking about? Of course we're unloading. Everyone's exhausted from the drive. She snapped her fingers at one of the cousins, urging him toward the staircase. I didn't move. The house is booked, I said, steady as the tide outside. Paying guests arrive tonight. You'll need to take your things back to the cars. For a moment, no one reacted, as if my words were in a language they couldn't translate. Then confusion rippled across the group. A few of the in-laws shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, the weight of their coolers suddenly awkward in their arms. One cousin muttered, almost under his breath, "We didn't know. Right on cue." The property manager appeared at the end of the drive, clipboard in hand, his shirt crisp, his stride brisk. He greeted me first, then turned to Marcella with professional detachment. "Ma'am, this property has been reserved. 2 weeks, paid in advance, at above market rate. I'm here to prepare for the renter's arrival." The whispers grew louder, embarrassment coloring faces that had moments ago been full of laughter. Marcella's expression twisted, disbelief colliding with outrage. "This is ridiculous. We're your family. Strangers don't come before us." I let the silence breathe before answering. "This isn't a family hostel. It's an investment. One I worked for, one I own, and one that will pay for itself starting tonight." A line had been drawn, and they could all see it. Some in-laws avoided my eyes. Others stepped back toward their vehicles, shifting from her side to neutrality. The strength of her entourage faltered, and the certainty she always wore like armor began to crack. Marcella looked around, waiting for someone to back her, to echo her outrage. But the crowd behind her was no longer unified. It was splintering, the loyalty she counted on dissolving into awkward silence. Her face flushed crimson as she turned back to me, her voice rising, desperate to reclaim the ground she was losing, but I had already set the stage for what came next. Marcella's fury was rising, her voice pitched sharp enough to cut glass. When I reached into the folder I had carried from Raleigh, I pulled out a plain envelope, thick with papers, and held it out between us. She hesitated, suspicion flickering across her face before she snatched it from my hand. Her bravado faltered as she flipped through the pages. Bank records, copies of trust withdrawals, each line stamped with her signature beside my name. Years of siphoning disguised as practical management. I had kept them quietly, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be weakness but weapon. Her hands shook as the papers rattled in the wind. Rage twisted across her features, but underneath it I saw something sharper. Fear. For once, her control was not absolute. "If you ever touch this house," I said evenly, "every dollar you stole becomes public record. Court, community, everyone. I won't stay silent again." A hush fell over the driveway. One of her in-laws, a man I barely recognized, shifted uncomfortably before taking two children by the hand, guiding them back toward the car. His eyes met mine briefly, full of apology that wasn't his to give. The sound of a car door closing punctured the tension, reminding everyone this wasn't a family gathering. It was a reckoning. Marcella's voice cracked when she tried to rally, the confident edge slipping. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, but it lacked the force it once carried. Her audience was thinning, her power unraveling in the daylight. I stood firm, letting her see the calm in me she could not shake. She clutched the envelope, desperate and cornered, her fury no longer landing the way it used to. The silence around us wasn't mine alone anymore. It belonged to everyone watching her stumble. And as more relatives edged back toward their cars, I knew the collapse was only beginning. Engines turned over one by one as the caravan began to unravel. Doors slammed. Muffled voices carried across the street, and I caught fragments of whispers, remarks about Marcella's arrogance, her habit of taking too much for granted. The crowd that had arrived with such noise and certainty now scattered in quiet retreat, each step away chipping at the authority she had worn like armor. Marcella stood rooted in the driveway, clutching the envelope as if it might vanish if she let go. Her voice rose in jagged bursts, calling after her in-laws, insisting they stay, trying to gather them back under her command, but they kept moving, eyes down, unwilling to return to her side. The children were buckled into cars, coolers shoved hastily into trunks, and one by one the vehicles pulled away from the house she had thought was hers to claim. As the last of the caravan disappeared, the caterers arrived, vans unloading trays of food meant for guests who would appreciate them. Movers carried in fresh linens, their steps sure and practiced, resetting the house not for family, but for paying tenants. The transition was seamless, as if Marcella's invasion had been nothing more than a brief disturbance in the tide. She screamed then, a raw sound that cracked in the open air. Rage, humiliation, disbelief, all of it spilling into the afternoon light with no one left to catch it. Her power had evaporated, her audience gone, leaving her exposed in a way I had never seen. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence held more weight than her shouting ever could. I had drawn the line, and this time it held. When I closed the door, the house seemed to exhale with me, already turning toward the quiet I had earned. That night, I carried a chair onto the deck and let the sound of the waves wash through me. The sand shimmered pale in the moonlight, the Atlantic restless but steady, a rhythm older than anything Marcella or I had ever fought over. Above me, the stars stretched wide and sharp, unbothered by the noise of the day. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down, no shadow stretching across my steps. I thought of the girl I had been, the one who yielded, who swallowed her words so that Marcella's could carry. That girl had walked behind her sister in Raleigh kitchens and crowded schoolyards, always the one to smooth the path, to absorb the sting. For decades, I had mistaken patience for weakness, silence for safety. But sitting there, the salt air on my face, I understood the truth. I had never been weak. I had been waiting. The house around me wasn't just wood, glass, and paint. It was proof that years of double shifts, frugal choices, and quiet resolve had built something solid. It was a line drawn in cedar and stone, a reminder that I could claim space without apology. Marcella's voice no longer filled the night. Her demands, her certainty, her entitlement had slipped into the past, and with them went the part of me that had always bent. I leaned back, listening to the ocean beat its endless rhythm, and felt the key warm in my pocket. The deed was mine, but more than that, so was the story. This house was not just an investment. It was my declaration that I would never again be erased.